As we said, we're Rachel and Becky, and we work here at the University of Lincoln in the Higher Education Research Institute. So this is a small professional services unit, which is staffed by researchers who undertake research specifically focused on aspects of higher education, and particularly issues of equality in higher education. So Rachel is the project lead on that evaluation of the Access and Participation Plan, and I am the research assistant. And we evaluate access and participation activities which support equitable student experience for diverse student groups. Could we skip to slide 3, Rachel? Brilliant, thank you. So a quick breakdown of what we'll be talking about. I'm going to give you a bit of background on widening participation and the Access and Participation Plan. And then Rachel's going to share her research with one group of students who come under the remit of APP, and that's students who are estranged from their families. So Rachel will talk a bit about what you can do to help this group and how you can get more involved in the APP work if that's an area of interest for you. So if you think about a kind of overarching concept of lifelong learning, then widening participation is an aspect of that, in that it focuses on tertiary education and specifically getting more people from all walks of life to participate in tertiary education. There's been a gradual process of the expansion of HE since the 12th century, really, but this has really taken off in the 19th and particularly in the 20th centuries. So this idea of everyone being entitled to education really took root, and we saw this widening of access to primary education, then secondary, and then tertiary levels of education as the 20th century progressed. But we really wanted to draw attention to the fact that widening participation, especially widening participation for HE, is considered a bit controversial sometimes, and it's certainly very highly politicised. So it's been argued that there was this process of massification of HE in the 20th century, but really we would think of widening participation, or WP, as something that's just focused on equality, so getting people into higher education who are typically underrepresented in the ranks. So that's people who wouldn't normally have considered applying to university. They have the ability, they have the qualifications, but perhaps they don't have a history of higher education amongst their family or friends for whatever reason. And WP, as we know it now, was sort of initiated in about 2003 with a paper called The Future of Higher Education. And the new Labour government published this white paper on higher education in England. And WP is now sort of associated with political policies which enable the increase in tuition fees. So universities who charge higher fees have to outline in an access agreement how they're going to use some of that money as bursaries and outreach, for example, to offset any negative effects that the higher fees for applicants from underrepresented groups. So we can see this commitment to widening participation sort of waxing and waning over time. And there are a lot of reasons for this, which I won't go into here. But just as a bit of a sort of illustration of how things have changed over the 20th century. So in the 1960s, the writer Kingsley Amis, who was a student himself at the time, he was very opposed to the idea that you should widen access to higher education. And he said the delusion that there are thousands of young people about who are capable of benefiting from university training, but have somehow failed to find their way there, is a necessary component of the expansionist case. It means that one can confidently mention a thing called quality and say it will be maintained. University graduates, however, are like poems or bottles of hock, and unlike cars or tins of salmon, in that you cannot decide to have more good ones. More will mean worse. But in contrast, a few decades later, the new Labour government famously were very keen on expanding HE, and they saw widening participation as a part of that. So, for example, they had this target of 50% of young people to attend university. Now, the current government have swung the pendulum back a little bit, and you can see some hints of that in this quote from Michelle Donnellan, who's the Minister of State for Universities. And she stated that we don't necessarily want everyone to go to university earlier this year. And there's a sense now from government that there should be more focus on FE and on economically driven skills training, and the pursuit of higher education isn't necessarily seen as a legitimate goal anymore. Can we have the next slide? Thank you. So we just wanted to outline the current state of widening participation. So we've said that typically WP has been focused on sort of outreach activities and student bursaries, so basically getting people through the door. But we currently tend to think about effective widening participation as being carried out across what we would call the student life cycle. So that means thinking about access to HE, the transition into university, success while you're here, and then progression after university. So examples of access activities might be things like visiting schools, supporting less advantaged children with their studies, or help with preparing UCAS applications. transition support, and that might be things like summer school. So at Lincoln, there is something called the WOW Week. So that's a summer school that Student Wellbeing run to help young people with a disability orientate to university life. Success, this is a kind of wide range of things. So it might be academic support from library staff, supporting finances or student wellbeing, inclusive pedagogy or decolonising the curriculum initiatives, for example. And then progression, so that would mean going on to postgraduate study or to a graduate level job. And that's generally supported by careers advice, work experience and job interview preparation. So guiding all of this activity is what are known as access and participation plans. So these set out the university's commitment to WP, and they're approved by our regulator, the Office of Students, and they're publicly available to anyone who wants to scrutinise them. So there have been various iterations of these commitments for a while, but since 2018, we've seen very sort of focused and target-driven plans being required by the regulator. And these draw on our institutional data on rates of access and attainment of different groups of students and looking at their graduate outcomes also. And this is essentially the widening participation environment that we work in now. So it's very data-driven and outcomes-focused. So just a quick overview of what APP looks like at Lincoln. So some universities have got dedicated widening participation units, and they have staff whose job it is to design and deliver some of the kinds of activities that I've mentioned. But a lot of the newer universities, like us, we operate slightly differently, and we take what's sometimes called a whole institution approach. So WP, or access and participation activity here, comes in the remit of one of our DVCs, that's Professor Liz Mossop, and key staff working on the access and participation activity report into what we call the Access and Participation Oversight Group, or APOG for short, and that's like a senior level governance committee. So operationally, we've got staff sitting in recruitment and marketing who work on outreach. We've also got colleagues in student wellbeing, student support, library, careers, and also in Lerry, supporting students across this life cycle. Staff in planning and business intelligence also, who look at the data, and then within the colleges and schools, the directors of education, they report into the APOG. And there's a lot of activity as well, so outreach and student support through personal tutoring, for example, which is delivered by academic staff like yourselves. So we have a community of practice which brings together all of these staff, and it's really important in keeping the focus and the coherence, because these are quite complex activities, they're often quite sort of disparate. So anyone with an interest in WP is welcome to come and join that group. And the last WP activity is evaluation, which is our remit. So the regulator are very focused on kind of what we might say what works, and the better understanding of which interventions are most effective and why. And so they want to know more about which activities are best at attracting different groups of underrepresented students, and if activities don't work, why don't they work, and what impact do support measures actually have on attainment, for example. So the focus is very much on evaluation research and trying to find out which programmes and interventions are the most effective. And this actually is a very recent development, just in the last couple of years. So we're starting now to move away from just kind of listing lots of activities that we do. And we're now being asked to justify them and to be honest and open about when we fail as well. So this is just a bit of an overview of what we might term underrepresented groups of students. These are the characteristics of students which would mean they fall under the remit of widening participation activity. And these are the kinds of students that are specifically targeted by the University Access and Participation Plan. And Rachel's going to talk a bit more now about one particular group of students, and that's for students who are estranged from their families.
Okay, thanks, Becky. So I'm going to focus on estranged students and a piece of work that I did in Lerry a few years ago, just to kind of bring that to life. So estrangement is actually quite a common experience, and Standalone are a charity who support people who are estranged from their families, and they say it probably affects about 1 in 5 families. And we think about estrangement, it doesn't fit easily into a really nice tight definition, and people do move in and out of it, but essentially it's a lack of contact. So you're no longer in communication with a member of your family, and for estranged students that's their biological or adoptive parent or parents. So they're aged between 18 and 24. They're at university, and they're studying without the support or approval of a network. And standalone think there's probably about 8,000 estranged students just in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So although on a kind of institutional basis, numbers can sometimes seem quite small across the sector, it's a huge proportion of the student body. Estrangement's quite complicated, and there are lots of different reasons why a student might be estranged from their family. But the most common reasons tend to be because of disownment, and that can work both ways. So a parent disowning a child, or a child deciding that actually now's the time that they no longer want to be in contact with a parent. It can be a choice, and sometimes it's a positive choice by a student to cut contact because there may have been neglect or abuse. Sometimes it's about differing beliefs, so often it can be when a student perhaps is open about their sexuality and they may be rejected by their family, and university is a time to say, well, actually, I'm going to distance myself from you now. So there's multiple reasons behind estrangement. And I think it's also quite important to say that estranged students are very similar to what we call care experienced students, in that they both may have had educational experiences that have been impacted quite negatively. But care experienced students, so they've spent any time in a local authority care, such as foster care or a residential care home, they've had some kind of dealings with the local authority. Estranged students, for the most part, haven't. So they don't tend to meet qualifying criteria because they've made that separation after 16, often sort of like at sixth form college, that kind of period. So they kind of slip through the net in many local authorities, which means that provision for them isn't as formal, and they can often seem quite invisible. So in 2017, we didn't really know very much about how many estranged students there were at Lincoln. So there was a bit of anecdotal evidence. So when I talked to colleagues in student funding, in the advice service, or in Wellbeing, they knew that they had come across estranged students, but there wasn't any kind of formal recording system of actually how many there were. So it was all quite anecdotal. And I'd been spending quite a lot of time reading the standalone literature, and I'd been really sort of impressed by their advocacy work, and the idea that actually it's really important to raise awareness, not only of the existence of estranged students, but to find out what the particular kind of circumstances are for those at your institution. So I felt that the best approach to this was probably a kind of qualitative piece of research, and I wanted something quite participatory because I knew they might be quite a vulnerable group. So I opted for photo elicitation, and although we didn't know how many estranged students there were at Lincoln, bizarrely what ended up happening was I emailed the entire undergraduate population. That was a mistake. But in a way, it was a good mistake because I actually recruited 8 estranged students to the study. And the point was that they would take photos during a university vacation. And that's really significant because holidays are such an important time. And there's this assumption that students go home to family or back to their mum and dad, and actually estranged students don't. So it was really important for them to document their experience, and then we use those images in focus groups to discuss, you know, what's it like to be an estranged student. Obviously, I've got lots of findings, but I'm just going to focus on some very key ones. Finance. So, you know, most students worry about money and paying for getting through university. But for estranged students, it's absolutely fundamental. So the student finance system is built on this kind of premise of parental financial support, mum and dad's income are assessed to decide how much maintenance loan you're going to get. Estranged students don't have that fallback, so we know that the system doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't actually give students enough money to live off. And this is the kind of assumption that parents will make up that shortfall, but estranged students don't have that. And there was recent research from an organisation called Save the Student, and they worked out that about £134 a month is kind of subbed by parents to students to make up that shortfall. And the majority, I think it was about 75% of students that responded, were very reliant on that money. So, I mean, that just gives you a sense of the importance of that kind of stopgap that a family are providing. So, estranged students are utterly reliable on paid employment, and that's, you know, a particular concern at the moment during the pandemic. Accommodation. Essentially, they're really worried that at the end of their degree they're going to be homeless. They don't have the option to return home, so there isn't that kind of safety net at the end. Oh, I can go home for a few months and have a bit of a think and maybe work out what I want to do. It's actually, I've got to take any job I can because I need to pay for rent and to live. And the other key thing about accommodation was kind of moving in, that transition. The awkwardness and embarrassment of moving in when people are there with their families, and you know, the conversation turns to, oh, who are you with? I'm here with my mum, and oh, my brother's dropped me off. And you know, it's at that point, do they say, actually, I'm not in contact with my parents, I'm here on my own? And that was a really big thing for the students in this study. And I don't think you'll be surprised to know that wellbeing and the impact on mental health of estrangement, not only the estrangement itself could be very traumatic, ongoing. People move in and out of estrangement, people try and get back in touch and reconcile, it doesn't work, or it works for a bit and then it goes wrong again. You know, that's an ongoing thing, and how it impacts on their student experience because of the things like finance and accommodation. Most of the students in the Lincoln study were either in contact with wellbeing or having counselling as well, and paying for it privately just because they really needed it. I'm not going to play this now because I'm running out of time, but it's a really small video if you want to watch it another time that the mental health transitions team, who are funded by the Office for Students, did based on this research, and it's just got some students reading through some of the quotes from the study, and it just brings it to life really. So I'll just flag that up as something that's quite a useful resource. So thinking about considerations for estranged students. So essentially, HE, there's all these assumptions about support. So it's not just financial, it's practical as well. You know, who's going to help you move in? Who's going to help you go home at the end of term? Who can you ring up when you're struggling? But who can you ring up when you've got a really great mark for your assignment and you're really happy and you want to share that with? You know, all those facets of support and that assumption that they're there, and for estranged students, they're not. Stigma, real feelings of shame and difference, and a taboo about talking about estrangement because people might think there's something wrong with you, and that might be why your parents have decided to cut contact. Isolation, not just during the holidays, but particularly during this year. A piece of work that we did earlier this year, there were some estranged students in that study, and you know, they were on their own because their flatmates had returned home. And estrangement can occur at any time. It doesn't just happen before people come to university so they can go in as an estranged student. It can happen when people are at university, and often does because it's an opportunity for a change, for a new life. But there is lots of support at Lincoln. In 2019, the university signed the standalone pledge. So that's a commitment by the institution, not that it recognises estranged students are at Lincoln, and it's got a range of measures to support them. And that was signed by Mary Stewart. So a real kind of visible declaration that we know that we've got estranged students at our institution, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that they have a good student experience and do as well as they can. So in the student funding team, there are people who have lots of experience around estrangement. We don't have an estranged students bursary. We have a bursary for care leavers, but we do have a financial package for accommodation over the summer holidays to help with students who perhaps haven't got any work but need to stay in Lincoln. And we also have financial assistance funds that can be accessed. There's a wellbeing advisor in student wellbeing whose specific remit includes estranged students, so she's well aware of the issues facing estranged students. And this year is the first year that we'll actually know who our estranged students are. So on the enrolment form, there's an option for students to identify as estranged. So we'll actually start to get some data on who our estranged students are and start to target them with kind of communications about the things that are here to help them. And I think, you know, one of the best resources, standalone, their website and social media presence, absolutely brilliant. They work with UCAS, they work with the Office for Students. They're a really good, strong advocate, and they've made a massive difference to the experiences of students across the sector. So, like Becky said, you know, if you're interested in finding out more about access and participation, we help facilitate a community of practice. We provide lots of information about professional development opportunities in this field and events that we think might be of interest. We've got a team site and we meet up. And we also undertake regular consultations with students that come within the remit of the plan. So if you ever come across any students that sound like they might be interested in this kind of work, you know, point them in our direction. We'd love to speak to them. So, you know, please get in touch if there's anything that we can help you with in relation to this part of the university's work. So, thank you.